as I said, I'm very proud and pleased by the speakers we have the next 2 days. And the next one I'd like to add a personal note about. For a considerable time, I've envied the scholarship of Joshua Zimmerman from Yeshiva University in New York, a recognized scholar and specialist, largely in the late 19th century. And Mr. Zimmerman now is at work on a biography of Josef Pilsudski, of all people. And judging on the little that I've collected about this, it's going to be good. So therefore, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague, and if I may, my friend, Josh Zimmerman.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this really important event. One of several around the world commemorating the 100th anniversary of the independence of Poland. My talk today is actually on Pilsudski and the independence of Poland, the American view. What I want to do is look at how America looked at this figure who became head of state and commander-in-chief of independent Poland in November 1918, and the ties between the two countries. I wanted to just start with maybe one a story that I started this research in May 2015. I went to Warsaw at that time to give a paper on a different topic and then actually do archival research. It just happened to coincide with two things. The presidential elections of May 2015 and the 80th anniversary of Pilsudski's death, May 12th. 2015. And what I found was interesting is happened to be there on a few days leading up to the elections and after, is that there were posters everywhere of two candidates, Bronisław Komorowski and Andrzej Duda, but then there was another poster that was also everywhere, and for some reason it was bigger than the other posters, and that was of Pilsudski. They had this iconic photograph of him that somehow they had put in color. So it wasn't clear at all that this was taken in 1923. It could have been taken in 2015. And I thought of, for the American tourist who's unfamiliar with Polish history, they may have thought that there were three candidates running, but that because one was bigger than the other, probably the favorite was Pilsudski in 2015. Interesting thing, in that month, Polityka, the magazine, came out with a special issue just on Pilsudski, and then Gazeta Wyborcza, on a weekend edition, included two free photographic albums on a Saturday and a Sunday, volume 1 and 2. Both of them were 45 pages. And it made me think, can you imagine that if, that on an anniversary of, let's say, President George Washington's death, that the New York Times included two free photographic booklets in their Sunday New York Times edition. It's just something that wouldn't happen. It showed the kind of the critical importance of Pilsudski, but for some reason I felt that there was almost as much excitement about that third poster than the first two. So let me go to my talk today. It's really about the legacy of Pilsudski. Now, in early 1917, prior to America's entry into the war, and prior to the fall of the Tsar in March 1917, President Woodrow Wilson became the first leader of a great power to openly and unambiguously champion the Polish cause. In what has become known as his Peace Without Victory address to the United States Senate on January 22nd, 1917, he made the following statement, quote, "No peace can last or ought to last which does not recognize and accept the principle that governments derive all their just power from the consent of the governed, and that no right anywhere exists to hand peoples about from sovereignty to sovereignty as if they were property. I take it for granted, for example, that statesmen everywhere are agreed that there ought to be a united, independent, and autonomous Poland," unquote. Now, the late American scholar Harold Fisher came out with a book 11 years later in 1928 called America and the New Poland. And in that book, he commented that the significance of Wilson's address, quote, lies in the fact that this was the first occasion when the chief of a great power championed the Polish cause without doing so in the interest of someone besides the Poles, unquote. Now, following the collapse of the Romanov dynasty in February, March 1917, 1 month after Wilson's address, Wilson went before a joint session of the United States Congress in April 1917 to request a formal declaration of war against Germany. The Senate and House of Representatives gave Wilson their approval on April 6, 1917, bringing the United States formally into war with Germany. Now, 9 months after the American entry into the war, Wilson advanced the Polish cause further in an address to a joint session of Congress on January 5, 1918, outlining his blueprint for a post-war peace in his now famous 14 points. Reading point number 13 to the American Congress, Wilson declared, quote, an independent Polish state should be erected, which should include the territories inhabited by indisputably Polish populations, which should be assured a free and secure access to the sea, and whose political and economic independence and territorial integrity should be guaranteed by international covenant, unquote. Now, the key phrase here, that the new Poland would be guaranteed by an international covenant, was the basis for Wilson's point number 14, his final point, which he read out loud to the U.S. Congress. Quote, a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenant for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike, unquote. Now, as the late and great historian, Professor Biskupski's mentor at Yale, Piotr Wondich, observed in a 1980 study entitled The United States and Poland, this support for the independence of Poland, quote, made Wilson a hero in Polish eyes and ensured the Wilsonian cult, unquote. A half century earlier, in 1928, Henry Fisher likewise concluded that, quote, world opinion reacted to President Wilson's eloquent advocacy of the rights of self-determination as a war aim of America and ultimately of the Allies, unquote. Now, some Polish leaders at the time, however, were of the opinion that, that Wilson stopped short of fully expressing the aspirations of the Polish people, both at home in Poland and abroad. Ignacy Paderewski, then a delegate of the Polish National Committee in in Washington, objected to the wording in the wording of the phrase, quote, and I'm now quoting from the 14 points, quote, an independent Poland should be erected, quote unquote. He objected to that particular phrase. Paderewski argued that the phrase should have read, quote, an independent Poland must be resurrected. So let's go back. The phrase was an independent Poland should be erected, and he said it should have been an independent Poland must be resurrected, both to convey to the world Poland's long, continuous state history prior to the partitions, but also that a free Poland would be a non-negotiable outcome of the war. So he objected to the word should, conditional upon later outcomes. As with other Polish leaders, Paderewski also objected to suggestions that a future Poland would be based on ethnic rather than historic frontiers. Now, their misgivings notwithstanding, Wilson's address solidified the unique status of the United States in the Polish national psyche. But it was not only these public declarations of support during World War I, as the historian Janusz Cisek has emphasized. The enormous aid program that began in January 1919 through the American Relief Administration further strengthened America's position in Polish eyes. As at its peak, the American Relief Administration provided meals daily to over 1.3 million children in Poland. Now, with the conclusion of World War I, early relations between the new Poland and the United States were quite positive. However, the American attitude towards Poland's head of state and commander-in-chief, Josef Pilsudski, was an ambivalent one. In his 1986 study, the American historian, Professor Neil Peace, who is among us and will be giving a keynote address tomorrow, wrote, and I quote, "Since the World War, American observers of the Polish scene had tended to disapprove of Pilsudski as a military adventurer of socialist pedigree who might steer Poland towards social radicalism and diplomatic belligerence," unquote. Now, we should recall that during the last third of World War I, Pilsudski was in a German prison in Magdeburg until the day before the end of World War I, so that all the Polish National Committee and its personnel had no recourse to him during this time. So we can say that upon his dramatic return to Warsaw on November 10th, 1918, after over a year in incarceration in the German military prison, Pilsudski was undoubtedly greeted as a national hero. The Regency Council, the active Polish authorities in German-occupied Polish territories, named Pilsudski on November 11th Chief of State, and a few days later named him Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, putting the government and the army entirely in Pilsudski's hands. Pilsudski formed a provisional government, mostly of his former comrades in the Polish Socialist Party, and promised to retain power only until the conclusion of the country's first parliamentary elections, when a new government would be formed. It was set for February 1919. Now, even though Pilsudski has sided with the Central Powers for the majority of World War I, the victorious Allies did not deny his singular loyalty, above all, to his home and to his country and people. But the memory of his socialist past and wartime ties with the Central Powers lingered. For example, Henry Fisher, going back to his book in 1928, aptly wrote, and I'm quoting, "Pilsudski's service in the forces of the dual monarchy and his brief collaboration with the Germans in the Council of State had not been forgotten by the Allies, despite Pilsudski's later conflict with the Germans and his incarceration at Magdeburg. More damning at this particular moment to Pilsudski's standing in the West were his socialist opinions and his long revolutionary career," unquote. So that's where we're, and the other thing that he reminded, Fisher makes, I think, an important point, which is in the aftermath of World War I, the enemy of the Western Allies shifted from Germany to Bolshevik Russia. And therefore, he showed that essentially any past association with socialism tainted leaders at the time in the view of the Western Allies because of the suspicion that they may have sympathies with Bolshevik Russia. Now, unlike Paderewski, who lived in the United States for some time, for example, his first concert in the United States was in 1891. Of course, he was an internationally renowned concert pianist, so he had a long standing with the relation with the United States. He spoke fluent English. Unlike him, Pilsudski never spoke English, although he read it fluently, and he spent a total of 11 days in America during his lifetime, while en route while en route to Japan in June 1904 during the Russo-Japanese War. Now, but the fact is that relations, the view of America, of Pilsudski at the beginning was that he was very he appeared to be pro-American. To give you an example, in a telegram to the American president sent just 5 days after the independence of Poland on November 16, 1918, Pilsudski referred to Wilson as Poland's, quote, first champion, unquote. Shortly afterwards, in December 1918, Pilsudski sat down with a reporter from the New York Times in Warsaw. Quote, "I am a strong admirer of America," Pilsudski told the reporter, and it was reported in the New York Times. "It was my good fortune to visit there in 1904, although only for a few days," unquote. American officials who met with Pilsudski frequently at this time reported positive pro-American views. For example, William R. Grove, representing the American Relief Administration in Poland, wrote in his Warsaw diary on February 10, 1920, the following. On that day, he had met with Pilsudski. Quote, "General Pilsudski seems to like the Americans. In fact, all of the Allies," unquote. According to Hugh Gibson, the first American minister to Poland, who served from 1919 to 1924, Pilsudski singled out the United States as Poland's best friend among the Allies. In a report to the United States Department of State on April 9, 1920, Gibson commented that according to Pilsudski, America was, and I'm quoting from the report, he had just met with Pilsudski that day, Pilsudski told him that, quote, "America was the only country which had no selfish interests to serve in her dealings with Poland," unquote. Initially, when Poland emerged as an independent state, the American media, however, expressed alarm at the scale of power given to this one man, Pilsudski. For example, in December 1918, a reporter in the New York Times reporting from Warsaw wrote, and I quote, "Pilsudski has assumed a dictatorship and is exercising government with a firm hand." The article was entitled, quote, "Pilsudski, Dictator in Russian Poland," December 3rd, 1918, from the New York Times. And also we can say, but as American journalists gained access to Poland's new leader more and more, reports became more positive. For example, in an interview at his residence in Warsaw in late December 1918, a different New York Times reporter portrayed Pilsudski as a reasonable, capable leader who was forced by the conditions of the times to take charge of his country. The motivation, according to the report, was not a lust for power, but rather to provide stability during a transition to democratic parliamentary rule. Pilsudski assured the New York Times reporter that the present state of affairs was only temporary. As Pilsudski said to the reporter, quote, "A permanent government will be established after the January elections to the Diet, or Parliament," unquote. Asked about misgivings of the American public regarding his socialist background and political views, Pilsudski replied emphatically, and I'm quoting, "I am neither a socialist nor a Bolshevik, but a Democrat," unquote. So that's what he told the New York Times reporter. Now he then went on to extend his gratitude to the United States and her allies. This is in the same article, the interview with Pilsudski, from December 1918. Quote, "Let me first say," Pilsudski said, "how happy I am that there is a united Poland. Our independence is due entirely to the Allies. Otherwise, it would always have been a fiction," unquote. Despite Pilsudski's repeated assurances, the United States and the Americans expressed their wish that someone other than Pilsudski should form a new government in January 1919. And that man was Ignacy Paderewski. The Americans communicated their wish through Hubert Hoover, who was the program director of the American Relief Administration at the time. Now, prior to Hoover's arrival in Poland, he sent two assistants, Dr. Vernon Kellogg and William Grove, both of whom arrived in Warsaw on January 4th, 1919, ahead of the elections to Poland's first parliament. Grove recalled that the two were granted a meeting with Pilsudski on that same day. He jotted down in a journal entry the following, and I quote, "We found Pilsudski to be a very agreeable man with a sense of humor," unquote. Now, Grove later wrote a kind of autobiographical account using some of his diary entries, and he went back to that meeting and said the discussion was important, and he says at this and subsequent meetings, he said Pilsudski was very plainly dressed, no frills, no bunk. This is what he said. In Grove's opinion, he was plain and soldierly. This is an interesting observation. Now, a few days later, Kellogg cabled Hoover that the country was deeply divided. Kellogg's cable stated that the country was in political turmoil, but that Pilsudski had the army's backing and should remain chief of state. Now, to unify the divided political landscape, Kellogg strongly recommended that Paderewski be appointed prime minister and be allowed to form a unity government. Back in Washington, Hoover met with government officials who agreed that this should be the American position, and then Hoover thus went ahead and instructed Dr. Kellogg to communicate to Pilsudski the American position favoring Paderewski as the head of a new government. As Hoover later commented, quote, Paderewski was a man of superlative integrity, deeply imbued with a democratic ideal, unquote. Now, Pilsudski conceded that Paderewski was something he used, had a common language, quote unquote, with the Western Allies and was ideal for the position. Paderewski went to Warsaw for negotiations with Pilsudski, who on January 17, 1919, appointed Paderewski as prime minister and asked him to form a new government. On January 30th, 1919, America was the first Allied state to formally recognize the new government that came into power. Ignacy Paderewski enjoyed the esteem of American officials. Now, for example, during the war, he had been an Allied loyalist and representative of the political center-right. For example, Professor Peace has demonstrated that in contrast, Pilsudski's past affiliation with the Central Powers compromised him in American eyes, even moving in, kind of like despite his clear pro-American views, but clearly that he was, this kind of cast a shadow over him. Now, when Paderewski's government fell in November 1919, however, it left Pilsudski in charge. And then as Peace argues, quote, the Americans feared for the course of Polish policy in the hands of a man they considered unreliable military adventurer. Their interest in Poland as a diplomatic partner correspondingly waned, unquote. So clearly he was ambiguous in Western eyes. Now, in fact, relations between the U.S. and Poland began to deteriorate at this time and continued to do so for the next 5 years. The late Professor Vondich wrote that by 1921, American thinking about Poland showed a certain decline of sympathies. This was due in part to outbreaks of pogroms reported between 1919 and 1920 in the American and international media. Now, two other factors also played an important role in the deterioration of Polish-American relations in this time. The first was America's emerging isolationist orientation, culminating in the U.S. Senate's vote against joining the League of Nations in late 1919. The League of Nations that America itself formed. Now the U.S. is out. It decided not to join. And this was followed by the victory of the Republican isolationist candidate in the 1920 presidential election, Warren Harding. Now, the second factor was Pilsudski's military ventures in the East. The American unease with Pilsudski, expressed already in 1918, dramatically increased in the spring of 1920 as Polish troops marched eastward in the direction of Kiev, for example. And now we can talk about a kind of American-British view. The Times of London reflected many American views when on April 19th, 1920, the Times of London blasted the Polish leader, writing, and I quote, "The fable of Polish imperialism has alienated a great deal of the natural sympathy in Entente countries for Polish aims and aspirations," unquote. Earlier, the U.S. Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, summarized the American position, stating that the U.S. could not, quote, "take responsibility for advising Poland on policy towards Russia," unquote, and should not proceed based on the expectation of American military or economic aid. Hugh Gibson, however, remember who was the Polish, the American ambassador to the United States, resident in Warsaw, he opposed this approach and wrote at the time that he believed the U.S. was, quote, "cutting Poland adrift," unquote. Now, of course, we can say that these views shifted of Pilsudski as the Polish army encountered, engaged, and then ultimately defeated the Red Army at the gates of Warsaw in August, September 1920. So really, the view of Pilsudski shifts from one in which he's a military adventurer and an imperialist, now to one who has literally saved Western civilization from a communist onslaught. And I wanted to just give you a sense of this, is that what's interesting is that upon his death, there were several obituaries written all over the world. And what stands out really in the obituaries is this particular legacy, which is the defeat of the Red Army, which, as everyone knows, could have taken over the whole of Europe. We do have internal cables from Tukhachevsky, who was the general on the front, who said Warsaw is just a bridge to Berlin and then to Paris and London for a European Soviet Socialist Republic, right? So there was a kind of clear danger around the world, and so the Polish defeat was considered a central event. So I want to just give you a sense that in the Times of London, for example, Pilsudski, after his death, was hailed as having, quote, "frustrated the only serious attempt made by the USSR to carry Bolshevism across Europe by force of arms. Having established the frontier of the new republic, he spent the last ounce of his already overstretched strength to consolidate Poland's position at home and abroad," unquote. Some referred to Pilsudski as, quote, "a great soldier and capable master of statesmancraft." For others, Pilsudski's importance lay in other areas, but wanted to give you an example of his legacy. Now, in terms of just historiographical work, right after his death, 2 biographies came out in the year 1936. And one of them was by an American biographer, Grace Humphrey, who had written several biographies of different figures. And her book came out in 1936, so imagine to try to evaluate the legacy of Pilsudski a year, actually a little bit less than a year after his death. And I thought I would read her evaluation, which was very important. So this is a quote from Grace Humphrey from her book titled Pilsudski, Builder of Poland, published in New York in 1936. Quote, 2 or 3 generations must pass before there is perspective enough to see Pilsudski in relation to his era, to Poland's history, to the rest of Europe, to the world. As commander-in-chief in 1920, as executive, as advisor in financial matters, as initiator of plans for the Foreign Office, he gave a monumental service to the reborn state. And then she says, she concludes that the merest outline of his life is a summary of the story of Poland. That's the way. And then I think, as you also know, about 1 decade after the Battle for Warsaw, of course, we have this British statesman, Lord Abernon, who wrote a book on this topic, in which he called the Battle of Warsaw, he used the term, one of the decisive battles of world civilization. So 10 years after that, he wrote a book saying this was one of the most decisive battles of world civilization. But I wanted to conclude with a quote from Joseph Rothschild, who I think, let me just find that, it's right here. Okay. So in 1966, an American political scientist wrote a book called Pilsudski's Coup d'etat in 1966. And then he tried to evaluate Pilsudski's legacy, and I thought, I'll conclude with this. He said this, that, quote, that something like, in this study, Rothschild asserted that however one regarded Pilsudski's increasingly authoritarian style after 1926, quote, it must be acknowledged that Pilsudski merits primary credit for the fact that today the notion of a Europe without a Polish state is no longer conceivable, unquote. Thank you. Should I stay up here? Sure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Zimmermann, for your remarks, almost 4% of which I agree with. Mr. Zimmermann mentioned Lord D'Abernon, a keen observer of things Polish. I found a quotation from D'Abernon fairly recently, and I found it quite fascinating. D'Abernon said, only one great man emerged from World War I, Josef Pilsudski. Interesting. With that having been said, I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments, please. Even if they're hostile to our guests. Yes, Ed?
66. Oh, yes. So it's by Joseph Rothschild, and he wrote a book just called Pilsudski's Coup d'etat. Yeah, it was published in 1966. Yes, please.
Yes, sir. You made a good case in terms of the consideration of the American government and its trainings of Pilsudski. How much of this was really received by the American public in the sense there were articles in the Times, but how much of it mattered to the quote-unquote normal American?
Right.
I mean, wasn't that the conceptual map of the American man?
Right, right. So, you know what, I have to plead ignorance on that because we don't really know how people received opinions from newspapers and media. You know, it was a dramatic time at the end of the war. America, about 250,000 Americans, soldiers perished in World War I, right? There was a huge contribution. And now America entered the stage of kind of chief negotiator at the Versailles Treaty. So there's a lot of interest, I think, in the new Europe. About Pilsudski, I'm not exactly sure how much interest, other than in Polish-American circles. So I don't know if there's been studies on that to look at like maybe local newspapers, editorials, but it's a good.
Yes, ma'am, please.
Was there a formal reaction by the American government to the 1926 coup d'etat?
Okay. About the 1926 coup d'etat. So, you know, that's a great. I would actually like to open that up. Maybe if Professor Biskupski would have. I just know, you know, about opinion. I think there was certainly there was unease with what seemed like an extra legal act in Poland by simply literally like taking. You know, if we remember that, we think that about 150 Poles died on the streets of Warsaw during the coup d'état. So there was actually bloodshed. We think there was 1,500 casualties. Now this was never intended, and Pilsudski was terribly wrought over this, because he never intended there to be any bloodshed over this. And so I think that there's probably an ambivalent feeling about that, but maybe Professor Biskupski would know more about the American reaction to the coup.
That's a good, excellent question. As a matter of fact, I've not studied newspaper opinion, for
Yeah.
instance, about the episode.
Yeah.
But as you remarked in your earlier comments, I think the Americans sort of lost their affection for Pilsudski pretty fast.
I see.
Further yes, sir, in the back.
Well, I was going to add to that briefly because I wrote about this.
Oh, please.
The American attitude, there was an issue of concern, which flew over rather quickly once it was clear that the order was being restored, and this was a more or less centrist government that wasn't going to pose a threat and everything. The main concern was that there were some ongoing projects with the previous Polish government, which was considered to be friendly, pro-American.
Okay. I see.
That
Okay, I wanted to maybe state one thing. I remember being at the Pilsudski Museum in Warsaw and speaking with Professor Cisek, who's one of the heads of that museum, and of course he's the co-author of the Kalendarium Życia Józefa Pilsudskiego. It's the 4-volume chronicle of Pilsudski's life. So he's really has encyclopedic knowledge of Pilsudski, right? But he reminded me that if the coup took place in May, literally in April, Soviet Union and Germany signed a military cooperation agreement. And so not only was there further decay internally in Poland with multiple changeovers of government, I think there were 14 governments between 1919 and 1926, so there was extreme instability. So that was one concern. And then the notion of, because remember, Pilsudski was a student of history, and he not only did he take great interest in the partitions, but he wrote on 1863 Polish insurrection. He was very keenly aware of the possibility of the Soviet Union and Germany possibly taking advantage of this situation, especially when I think Germany never actually recognized the Western border. So there's still that problem of that. And of course, there was bitterness with the Soviet Union over the Treaty of Riga. So two hostile neighbors, increasing instability inside. And so I think his feeling was if he didn't come in and take power and stabilize the government, Poland could actually collapse under the weight of a foreign invasion. So I'd be interested if...
Further comments or questions for our speaker? Sure. Thank you, Josh, very much.
Thank you.
I enjoyed very much Mr. Zimmerman's very incisive and fascinating remarks about Pilsudski, and as I'm sure many of, not all of you realize, Pilsudski occupies an almost mystical status in Polish thought and Polish affections. And I remember a story that you might find interesting. I knew I was a close friend of a priest, a nice fellow, a Pole, although he had an Irish name. Things like that happen, don't they? And he told me once that several years before, he was gravely ill. I think he had suffered a heart attack, and his life was despaired for, and he himself thought that he was reaching the end. And then he told me, as I lay there in sadness, I looked up at the wall, and I saw his picture. And having seen his picture, I was saved. Now, of course, we would all think that was Jesus. It was Pilsudski.